I used to think that audiobooks were not for me, and this book and its narrator convinced me otherwise. So welcome to Mad on Books, where I talk about fantasy mostly, science fiction sometimes, and comics occasionally. This is a pretty awesome book, but like many books, maybe it's not for everyone. But let's start with what it's got. A strategic protagonist with a strong voice, visceral action, mysterious, kind of terrifying magic, plenty of criming, PTSD, harsh justice, government corruption, quite a lot of murder, lots of steel, and a lovely atmospheric cover. So have you ever asked yourself, what if Peaky Blinders, but with swords and magic? If you have, you'll probably love this book. If you've seen Peaky Blinders, the plot summary is Peaky Blinders, basically. If you haven't seen Peaky Blinders, I'll get into the plot a little bit. But if you're looking for a very short recommendation, if you love fantasy and you loved Peaky Blinders, you'll probably love this book. So very general, non-spoilery story summary. It already in the first couple of chapters, this is all pretty much clear. There is a man, Thomas Piety, and he and a number of soldiers are returning from a war. A pretty horrific war is also made pretty clear pretty quickly. And they are coming back to Thomas Piety's home city, where he used to be a criminal mastermind. He used to run a criminal empire, and in his absence, a lot of it has degraded, and properties and possessions have been taken off of him. And most of the story is basically him fighting to get all of his stuff back. As I said, pretty Peaky Blinders, including a very strategic, somewhat cold main character who has a wild, out of control, slightly crazy brother, and a crew of misanthropes. The whole story is told in first person. So Thomas Piety is the one telling us the story. We get to know him quite well. For me, it was quite a change of pace because I'm used to, recently, I've been reading McLean Book of the Fallen, where every 2 to 5 pages, you might be jumping into another character's head. In this one, we spend the whole time with Thomas Piety. We only get his perspective, and it narrows things down a lot, and it becomes much more intimate in a way. We only experience, of course, the things that he's actually there for. There are other things going on in other places, but we don't see them because we're stuck in Thomas Piety's head. Thomas Piety is, like I said, a little bit cold, quite strategic and a bit Machiavellian in how he's planning things and how he's intending to get all of his stuff back. He doesn't care too much who gets hurt or who dies. It's like I said, there's quite a lot of murder in the book, but it's not, I don't know if I'd call it grimdark. I mean, the city that most of the book takes place in is pretty dirty, and there's a lot of poverty, and there is a fair bit of fighting and killing, but it doesn't seem like, I don't like the term grimdark anyway. It is kind of grim. It is in places quite dark, but I wouldn't say it's full on grimdark. I'm not sure why, but maybe because there seems to be a bit more humor, maybe a bit more hope. It's grim sometimes. It's dark sometimes. The themes have a lot to do with trauma. All of the crew that Thomas Piety has around him are soldiers that have been in an extremely horrific war with him, and he himself and a lot of the other people in his crew suffer from what we would now call PTSD. They are triggered quite often in the book by certain experiences, things that come up that bring them back to the horrific battles that they've been in. There's also a lot about loyalty. Of course, it's a criminal crew where everybody is to some degree maybe untrustworthy, but you have to have a certain kind of trust to be able to run the crime syndicate, and you have to have a certain kind of acceptance of leadership and loyalty. And there are constant things moving around with Thomas and his brother Johann, with Thomas and other people in the crew. There's a little betrayal. There's the question of trust and loyalty comes up pretty often. Obviously, it's a story about a charismatic leader of a bunch of people that he's trying to get to do what he wants. So there's quite a bit of, as a theme, quite a bit about ego and comparing Thomas Piety to other criminal lords and ladies, the leaders of rival gangs, dealing with the ego of government officials and the police, or the City Watch. And that overlaps a lot with greed as a theme as well. Why is Thomas doing this? In some cases, it seems like it's purely ego. He just wants his things back. But it's also greed. Yeah, there's a lot of money in it. And the competing greed and competing ego of different groups is constantly a thing that comes up in the book. I'm also interested to talk a little bit about audiobooking. There are chapters, so you can skip this if you're not interested, but for me, audiobooks were always kind of a not really for me kind of thing. I tried some years ago and they just didn't really work for me, and I don't know why. It was a long time ago. But recently, with starting my new job, I've got a long commute, so I have time. And I thought I'd just try out an audiobook. And this was the first one. And I've got to say, John Lees, the narrator of this, is excellent. His voice, to me anyway, really, really suited the subject matter, the place. It all seems like it's kind of a medieval England kind of setting. There are guns, so it's maybe later medieval, after medieval. So gunpowder is there are guns, and there's a little magic. But the narration was what really grabbed me. He does, with just subtle changes of accents, tone of voice, that kind of thing. John Lees created very clear characters that you could recognize very easily, even though you're only hearing them. I really enjoyed it, and his narration especially seemed to suit the story extremely well. The world, like I said, it's maybe more early industrial age than it is really medieval, but there are a lot of bits of it that feel very medieval, like everyone's wielding swords and crossbows and that kind of thing. But there are also gunpowder guns and bombs and that kind of thing. It's a world with magic in it, but the magic is pretty distant from most people and is only introduced really directly through one or two characters. And we don't get to learn much about it. It's definitely a soft magic system, or at least we haven't learned enough about it to understand that it's hard, but I think it's going much more in a soft magic system direction. And as I said, it's quite a gritty world where nobody's problems are solved by magic. When magic actually comes up in the story, it's very arcane and kind of terrifying. And I'm interested to see where that goes. Which brings me to the last thing. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's later, Matt. Recording Matt kind of fucked up. Yeah, that's okay. It's kind of our shtick that we do What's It Got, which he did, and that we do a cover analysis, which he forgot. So I'm going to do that now. Don't worry about it, Matt. I'll take care of it. So the cover for Priest of Bones is one I actually really like. I've seen other covers which are maybe a refinement of this. I'm not sure if this is maybe an earlier edition or a later edition, or what exactly the difference between this and others are. But I think it's got some nice things going on. It's basically got 3 layers. So we've got the typography, which is obviously sitting on the layer closest to the viewer, on the top, so to speak. In the middle, we've got a very homemade, rough, ugly looking knife, which is pretty suitable, I would say, to the subject matter. I can totally imagine Thomas Piety or someone in this world or in his crew using this knife. And in the background, it's a nice image. It's basically an urban image of an old city, like a road receding in the distance behind the knife. It reminds me of a daguerreotype or a tintype, which are really, really old, the earliest photographic processes. And it has that kind of feel, which is kind of added to it a lot by having a little bit of a frame around it on the left and the right sides. The daguerreotypes and tintypes were very often, you see reproductions of them framed. So that sort of feels like it's referencing that. Maybe that's just my head goes there. And then it's got spatters of blood all over the place, which honestly feel maybe a little too much, that it's really not necessary. I think the cover would have probably done fine without it, but it does clearly signal to the casual glance on the bookshelf that this is probably a messy book where people get murdered, which is absolutely the case. Overall, I would give this a B+. I think this is a pretty damn good looking cover, and it also sits really nicely in a set. Yeah, they all follow the same sort of general template, but they've got different colors, different objects, different pictures, but they're recognizably 4 books that go together when you look at the whole set together. The cover design is by K.D. Anderson, and the cover photographs are the street in the background is from Shutterstock by Slavea Gerge. And the sword, which looks a lot more like a knife to me, but the sword is by Jelena Jovanovic / Archangel, whatever that means. Which brings me to the last thing. It's a series of 4 books. The publisher actually sent me all 4 of them. 3 I've got so far, 1 more is coming. And I definitely plan on reading the rest because it's really, really enjoyable. It's a bit of a romp in a way. It's not light and funny, but it's just stuff is always happening, and there's a lot of edge of your seat moments. There's a lot of very dramatic what's going to happen kind of moments, and I really, really enjoyed it. I'm interested to see, I mean, at the beginning I said it's Peaky Blinders with swords and magic, which I wasn't being facetious. It really is basically Peaky Blinders with swords and magic. I don't think that's a bad thing. Peaky Blinders is an excellent story, and as a foundation for a fantasy story, it's a very good start. I am hoping that throughout the series that it goes a bit more original and less straight up Peaky Blinders, but the story that Peaky Blinders is telling is one that fits very well in a fantasy world. And the way Peter McLean, it is pronounced McLean, not McLean. I've heard a lot of people pronounce it McLean. I used to live in a place in America called McLean, spelt just like Peter's last name. And I actually wrote him on Twitter just to check. And it's McLean, not McLean. Peter McLean's writing is very engaging, very enjoyable. The character of Thomas Piety, he is not a clean good guy by any means, but he's fascinating. Yeah, we get a lot of layers of his personality, and it's really, really interesting to follow him, even though he's not a typical hero. He is definitely fascinating. So I definitely recommend Priest Bones, and I'm really excited to see where the series, which is called War for the War for the Rose Throne. I'm really excited to see where the series goes. So as always, I hope you're doing well and keep reading awesome books, and I'll see you next time.